Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some things today that have been touched on already, and that may be a little hard to talk about, and I want to try and do it as thoughtfully as I can. And so I'm going to talk about complex trauma and what happens when that meets what you might call a psychedelic enthusiasm, and just some things that I've observed and learned, and that have kind of emerged recently in the media, as some of you have noticed. And so I want to start by, of course, Bessel is someone who has long drawn our attention to the complexity of trauma and developmental trauma, and how a lot of the trauma we work with as clinicians is rooted in, early, really deep harm in relationships of neglect, emotional neglect, physical neglect, as well as abuse of different kinds. Of course, it's rooted in war and sexism and capitalism and racism and all kinds of ways that people and their families are being dominated, exploited, and harmed in various ways. And so there's, PTSD doesn't begin to capture what a lot of our clients are dealing with, and what a lot of people, if we let them into our research studies, which did happen in the phase 3 study, that they're struggling with. And so another person I want to invoke at the beginning, in addition to Bessel and all he's done in this, is Judy Herman, a longtime colleague of ours here who will be speaking tomorrow, author of a classic book, Trauma and Recovery, Before the Body Keeps the Score. Trauma and Recovery was, and still is, a classic and very, very important book in this field and the work we do. And Judy really talks a lot about complex trauma and, people who have been deeply wounded by situations of captivity and domination and exploitation and humiliation, and how people can internalize that and how that can play out in their relationships in the world, but also in their relationships in therapy. And another key concept that Judy talks about is what she calls the dialectic of trauma. I think this is so important to keep in mind. We live with the dialectic of trauma, and sometimes we do it in blind spots, and as individuals and as organizations, and that's some of what I want to focus on today. And so the dialectic of trauma has to do with, on the one hand, at times being flooded and overwhelmed by the horror of what you've been through, and then at other times feeling disconnected from that, doubting it's really true. Was it really that bad? Am I just making all this up? Am I just trying to get attention? Those kinds of things. And this doesn't just happen within traumatized individuals. It happens in communities. It happens in entire cultures. It happens in the field of psychotherapy. And it's happening in this psychedelic work. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So, an important thing about complex trauma is that it's not just symptoms that people experience within themselves, and some of those have been talked about today, but it really has a relational aspect where people can get caught up in reenactments of their trauma. And these reenactments can be not just around acts of commission, like the most egregious things, for example, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but also acts of omission, so people re-experiencing neglect, re-experiencing abandonment, re-experiencing being blamed, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, by their therapist for difficult things that are emerging in the session. And so these reenactments are really some of the hardest and most important work that we do as therapists. How do we acknowledge for ourselves, what contributions we've made to this situation, and how do we repair it? And that's so important. And so in terms of this idea of psychedelic enthusiasm, I know, when did I start? I meant to do my own clock. How far am I in, Bessel?
You're 10 minutes in.
Seriously? Wow, time flies. Okay. So yeah, sometimes it's called the Michael Pollan effect. Sometimes we might call it the Rick Doblin effect. I mean, Rick is incredibly visionary and inspiring, and it does show up in this work, as we've seen as therapists. And I'm forgetting who talked about it earlier today, but people show up and they say things like, nothing else has been enough. I've got to get more healing or I'm not going to make it. People are showing up like, this is it. If you don't help me with this MDMA, if you can't help me with this ketamine, I'm going to die, and you can help me. They've seen the stories in the media. They've seen, this is great. This can really heal people. 10 years of therapy in 8 hours. They hear these things out there. And so there's, been a lot of, encouragement, but also a lot of hype. About what these medicines can do, and a lot of desperation of people with complex trauma is bumping up against that hype and those hopes for rapid, deep healing. And recently there's been some attention brought to people who've been harmed in this work. So there was a podcast called Power Trip, New York Magazine and Symposia. And this is a podcast that was put on by people who are avowed anarchists and who, I would say are clearly quite biased and upset about things. But also I think they're shining really important light on some things that have been going on in the underground world and that even have happened to people in the MAP studies. And so I just want to address that briefly. That, there is a lineage in this work of, the best of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is good trauma-informed therapy, right? You are empowering people, you are connecting to them, you are supporting their autonomy, all the beautiful things that Susan and Francis and Michael and others and Anne have talked about, and the way this work can be done. But there is also a lineage of people doing this work who are on power trips, and who are into breaking down people's ego or think that they know better than the client what they need to experience. And they have hurt people, and they are continuing to hurt people. Right now, today, there are underground therapists and above ground therapists who struggle with these things, and who are on power trips and who are hurting people. I just talked to a friend of mine last night who had a ketamine experience with someone who was just utterly intrusive and constantly telling her what to think and do. And, she was a sweet person on one hand, but she was on a power trip. And so in the MAP studies, 3 kinds of harm have been pointed to, I think, recently. And it's been painful for me because I'm part of the MAP studies. I'm one of the therapists, and I have deep respect and care for Rick and Michael and all of us who are involved with MAPS. But in this, Power Trip podcast, they talked about, the case that gets the most attention is someone who was ended up having sexual intercourse repeatedly with one of her therapists from this study, but long before that, there's excerpts of the videotapes from the MDMA sessions in the trial. We don't have all the information, but there's some things that are pretty clear, and her autonomy was being trampled on in a big way from the start. Before it ever got sexual, though even there were places where she's reliving a rape, and the male therapist is literally lying on top of her. There's all kinds of really disturbing things that I know that some of you have seen. How many people have seen this stuff? Yeah, so maybe not a majority. So sorry to focus on difficult things, but I think, there's a need for it. But there's also things that's egregious, right? Those things that, if you've seen that video, if you do hear it and watch it. But there's also people in that podcast who talked about things that are more common, reenactments for complex trauma, and that don't require a therapist to be on a power trip, that don't require us to point fingers at anybody. Of course, that's not really that helpful anyway, but basically, there's someone who talked about open heart surgery was their metaphor for their experience, that they went into this study, they got so opened up, and in some ways it was beautiful in the ways we've heard, but they ended up feeling that they were left holding the bag. They ended up feeling abandoned. They ended up feeling re-traumatized. Now, are they, and is the Power Trip podcast accurately describing what happened in those sessions? Probably not, you know. I'm not saying that we can just believe whatever they're saying, but certainly it's very clear that they ended up feeling abandoned, that they ended up feeling that they had been harmed, and they described not having experiences of repair to this day, from what I can tell. And so this is important too. It's not just about the headline grabbing stuff around whether someone, you know, was sexually violated or something like that. There's this potential for reenactments of abandonment and neglect, not repairing harm that comes. And this can happen in a research study, you know, and we don't have time for all the details. You know, Libby and I have worked with clients, and there's ways this can happen subtly. You know, we did work with someone, it went great, she thought it went great, and part of her experience was, wow, this is such good trauma therapy, that she dropped her therapist after the study, didn't tell us, and really struggled, and you know, could have died of a fentanyl overdose. So, you know, no one committed suicide yet, but this person almost died. And this was something that, you know, I have personally experienced and I feel some culpability in. So I don't want to be up here claiming that I'm like above it all. No, you know, and there were little signals that we missed about her relationship to her therapist. And so as we look forward and people are, you know, really excited about getting this out here, and we think about what happens after it's approved, you know, we really need to think about, well, who are the vulnerable complex D folks who are going to get caught up in reenactments? They can get caught up in them with their ongoing therapist, who may get into deeper water than they've ever been in before. Then there's the whole adjunctive therapy. In a way, this MAP study is like adjunctive. It's an adjunctive therapy kind of model, right? It's a 3-month or so model. And, you know, we've really learned that, like, hey, if it's someone with complex PTSD, they better have a good therapist and a good solid relationship to them before they come into the study. Because if you could do beautiful work, but if you open them up, they open up, and then they could be left feeling abandoned. You know, there could be some real harm there. And so these are just things that I want to point to, and I think that there's a lot more attention that needs to be paid to this in terms of who is selected, quote, selected for the studies, who's admitted into a psychotherapy process with these medicines, and then the training, you know. It's one thing for MAPS to say, hey, we've got to train 20,000 therapists or whatever, some huge number of people. How many of these therapists are really going to have the training, the supervision, the peer supervision to handle serious complex trauma? And so what does it really mean to, quote, train all these therapists? I think we really need to think about, you know, standards of care, standards of training, who's qualified to work with complex trauma, who's not, and how do we address that in a post-approval world? And what is the role of organizations like MAPS to really take responsibility for what they're unleashing into the world, which is good, but also there's real vulnerability there. And so those are the things that I wanted to focus on today. And there's a lot more that could be said about different details and things, and there's policy implications, and, you know, are we really going to trust, you know, the review boards, the licensing boards? So, like, how good of a job are they doing so far protecting people? Not good. Not the therapists or their clients, right? So what's it going to look like when a lot of complex trauma, people who are desperate for help, coming and getting opened up with these medicines, getting caught up in reenactments, and how are we going to deal with this? So those are the things that I wanted to focus on today. Thank you.